welcome to today's deep dive. We're opening up a text today that is just unapologetically designed to dismantle the modern consensus.
Yeah, it really takes no prisoners.
No, it doesn't. It's a highly provocative new 2025 ebook. It's titled Karl, Fowl, Marx, the Original Shitlib, and it's written by Konrad Riker.
Quite the title.
Right. And before we get into the actual mechanics of this book, just take a quick second to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive with us. And if, as we map out these arguments today, you decide you want to read the source material for yourself, you can find the ebook on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Definitely worth checking out if you want the full context.
Exactly. And you should also follow the author directly. His handle is @Konrad Riker on Substack.
So to give you some vital context on the framing here, this book is explicitly written as a manifesto.
Yeah, it's not a neutral history book.
Not at all. The target audience is very specific. He's writing for men's rights activists, the red-pilled community, and, men in the manosphere who basically operate from the premise that modern institutions have been entirely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to really unpack his extensive arguments about the history of our institutions before they were purportedly captured. We're going to explore the psychological and the biological roots of modern political culture exactly as they are laid out in this text.
But before we get into the architecture of those arguments, we need to establish a very clear framework for how we are handling this material.
Yeah, this is important.
Right, because this text contains highly politically charged right-wing critiques of left-wing ideology. So as we go through these concepts, we want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here.
None at all.
We're not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we condemning them. Our role today is strictly to act as impartial guides for you.
We're just looking at the machinery of the arguments.
Exactly. We're going to break down the historical claims, the evolutionary psychology frameworks, and the sociological theories in the source material so that you can thoroughly understand the author's perspective. We want you to see the specific message he is delivering to his audience.
So let's start with where the book begins, which is this really visceral deconstruction of Karl Marx himself. The first section is literally titled The Pustule in Soho.
It's quite an image.
It is. And it focuses heavily on the physical and domestic reality of Marx's life. The whole premise here is that grand economic theories cannot be separated from the material reality of the men who actually write them.
Right, you can't decouple the art from the artist, so to speak.
Exactly. And the text paints this incredibly grim picture of Marx's living conditions in this squalid apartment on Dean Street in London. It specifically highlights his really painful affliction with boils.
Furunculosis.
Furunculosis, right. And his absolute refusal to secure conventional employment. But what is the mechanism behind focusing so heavily on his physical ailments and his hygiene?
Well, the focus on the physical really serves as the foundation for a concept the author calls intellectual parasitism. The text points out that Marx famously declared the bourgeoisie would remember his carbuncles until their dying day.
He actually wrote that.
He did. And the argument presented is that Marx conflated his personal, dermatological and hygienic issues, which the book argues were brought on by his specific lifestyle choices, with a grand cosmic revolutionary struggle.
So his personal discomfort becomes a global political crisis.
Exactly. And to anchor this, the book brings in modern evolutionary psychology. It specifically references researchers like Gad Saad and David Buss.
Oh, they studied disgust sensitivity, right?
Yes, exactly. In evolutionary psychology, disgust is a pathogen avoidance mechanism. And some studies suggest a correlation where a lower tolerance for pathogens and disorder often aligns with more conservative, boundary-oriented political values.
Right, so if you're easily disgusted, you prefer strong boundaries.
Yeah. So the book posits that Marx, and by extension his ideological descendants, display a profound lack of this disgust sensitivity. The text frames this not as a tragic consequence of poverty, but as a psychological embrace of disorder, rot, and boundary dissolution.
And it goes way beyond just the physical environment of that apartment. It gets into how that environment affected his family dynamics. The book uses a very specific term for Marx. It calls him the original shitlib.
Which is a very internet native term.
Very much so. And it's defined in the text using the acronym NEAT someone, not in education, employment, or training.
Right.
The narrative details how Marx relied entirely on his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, for his financial survival. But the most severe critique the author levels centers on the fate of Marx's children.
That part is particularly dark.
It is. The text points to the tragic death of his son, Edgar. and it attributes it directly to preventable poverty, arguing that his father prioritized writing in the British Museum over securing basic necessities for his family, like coal or medicine.
And that domestic angle is utilized to completely dismantle what the book calls the halo effect of the starving artist or the noble scholar.
Society does tend to romanticize that, right?
We do. Historically, society tends to afford a certain romantic leniency to intellectuals who live in poverty. We just assume their material suffering is this noble sacrifice for the greater good of human knowledge.
But the text actively strips that leniency away.
It violently strips it away. Relying on historical records, including details from Francis Wheen's biography of Marx, the book characterizes him as a domestic tyrant. The argument is that there is a cold, utilitarian disregard at the heart of this behavior.
Because he couldn't even care for his own kids.
Right. The text points out that Marx's wife, Jenny, reportedly never forgave him for the preventable deaths of their children. And from a philosophical standpoint, the book views this inability to care for one's immediate kin as the fatal flaw in the entire Marxist worldview.
The ultimate hypocrisy.
It's exactly. The premise is that an ideology professing boundless, abstract love for a generalized humanity is often just a smokescreen. It's used by individuals who are entirely incapable of fulfilling the specific, localized duties of providing for their own families.
There's this really striking quote included in the text from Marx's mother, Henriette Pressburg. She reportedly expressed a wish that Karl would actually accumulate capital instead of just writing about it.
It's such a sharp maternal critique.
It really is, and the book uses it as a springboard to question the entire basis of Marx's economic theory. If the text argues that Marxism isn't fundamentally a genuine economic theory, what psychological mechanism is it replacing it with?
Well, the book turns to Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of resentment to explain this.
Resentment.
Yeah, and it isn't just everyday envy. It is a deep-seated, seething resentment that arises from an individual's sense of their own inferiority or failure. And then they project that outward as a moral failing of the world itself.
Yeah. So it's not that I failed, it's that the game is rigged and evil.
Yeah, exactly. The framework suggests that Marx's massive volumes on capital and class struggle were essentially a psychological projection of his own inadequacy and his refusal to compete in the market. By this logic, he suffered from the boils of envy and carbuncles of laziness, but he managed to convince millions that his personal failure was actually a profound, objective critique of the system.
So the ideology just becomes a rationalization tool.
A massive one. It masks incompetence with a veneer of moral superiority. The text sees this specific psychological maneuver reframing personal failure as systemic oppression as the absolute prototype for modern activism.
And that reframing leads to a really fascinating historical detour in the book. To explore the roots of this resentment, the author digs up an 1837 poem written by a young Karl Marx. It's titled Ulenem.
Yeah, that was a surprising addition to the text.
It really was. The text refers to this poem as a Rosetta Stone for understanding the entire ideology. What exactly is in this poem that makes it so central to the author's thesis?
The verses from Ulenem are just highly destructive in their imagery. The book highlights lines where Marx writes things like, "If there's something which devours, I'll leap within it, though I bring the world to ruins."
Wow.
And he includes vows to drag the heavens down and build a throne amidst the wreckage.
It sounds demonic.
Well, the text uses this poetry to argue exactly that. It claims the driving force behind the ideology was never a benevolent desire to liberate the working class. Instead, it frames the motivation as a deeply narcissistic, almost Gnostic hatred for reality itself.
Gnosticism being the idea that the material world is evil.
Right. Classical Gnosticism often viewed the material world as a corrupt prison created by a flawed deity, and it sought spiritual escape. However, the book argues that Marx took a different route. Rather than seeking escape, he sought the active destruction of the material and divine order.
So he didn't want to leave the prison, he wanted to burn it down.
Exactly. The text posits that he wanted to build a hell on earth where he could play God over the ruins. Consequently, his later economic theories are framed merely as the secularized, acceptable vehicle for a deeply personal vengeance against the structure of creation.
If that is the underlying motivation, it completely changes how we view his academic work. The book claims that Marx's greatest intellectual maneuver happened at university, a process the author calls mugging Hegel.
Mugging Hegel.
Yeah. Now, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a massive figure in 19th century philosophy, and his dialectic is notoriously complex. Let's unpack what Hegel's original framework was intended to do, and then how this text claims Marx altered it.
To understand the alteration, we really have to look at the original design. Hegel's dialectic, which is often simplified as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, was fundamentally a spiritual and philosophical tool.
Right, because Hegel was an idealist.
He was. He believed that human history was the process of the absolute spirit, or Geist, slowly unfolding and actualizing itself through time. It was moving towards ultimate rationality and truth. It was a framework designed to understand how ideas evolve and how consciousness elevates itself.
But Marx flipped it.
The book argues that Marx effectively hijacked this framework and stripped it of its spiritual and transcendent elements. He removed God, he removed the unfolding spirit, and he removed the concept of objective divine meaning.
So he just kept the conflict mechanism?
Yes, he took the engine of the dialectic and applied it strictly to the material world and class struggle, creating dialectical materialism. The text views this as a profound intellectual theft. He took a mechanism meant to elevate human consciousness toward the divine order and weaponized it to tear down material hierarchies through perpetual conflict.
And the concept of that divine or objective order brings up a massive theme in the book, the concept of logos. It is referenced constantly as the primary target of this ideology. How does the text define logos within the context of what it calls the war on logic?
The concept of logos has deep roots in Greek philosophy and early Christian theology. It famously appears in the Gospel of John. The book defines logos as the fundamental divine ordering principle of the universe.
And it codes this principle as masculine, right?
Yes, very strictly. It represents objective truth, the law of cause and effect, distinction, definition, and natural hierarchy. It is the force that brings order out of chaos, separating the light from the dark.
So it's the ultimate reality check.
Exactly. According to the framework laid out here, modern leftism actively seeks to exterminate logos because objective reality is the ultimate threat to what the author calls a mediocre collective.
Meaning, if reality is objective, then some people are just better at things than others.
Precisely. The reasoning is that if reality is objective and governed by cause and effect, then competence, effort, and the resulting hierarchies are entirely natural and justified.
But if you remove logos,
If you can use dialectical materialism to convince people that reality is merely a subjective social construct built on power dynamics, then any hierarchy can be violently overturned without moral hesitation. The book argues that the collective is terrified of the burden of individual agency and accountability that logos demands. So they wage a war on logic itself to dissolve those expectations.
okay, so if we accept the premise that logos, this ordering principle, is actively being dismantled, what does that actually look like on a societal level? The book transitions from Marx the man into how this ideological framework impacts modern gender dynamics, the family structure, and the state itself.
And it leans heavily on psychology here.
It does. It introduces psychological archetypes, specifically the terrible mother and the bad mother. Let's explore the psychology behind those archetypes before we look at how the author applies them to politics.
These concepts draw heavily from Jungian psychology. In Karl Jung's framework, archetypes are universal, primal symbols embedded in the collective unconscious. The mother archetype generally represents nurturing, safety, and life-giving sustenance.
Which sounds incredibly positive.
It is, but every archetype has a shadow side. The terrible mother, or devouring mother, is the shadow manifestation of that nurturing instinct.
How does she devour?
Instead of nurturing a child to eventually face the world as a strong, independent adult, the devouring mother consumes her children psychologically. She prioritizes her own need to be needed over the child's development.
So she keeps them weak on purpose.
Exactly. She keeps them in a state of perpetual infancy, shielding them from every conceivable harm. And that ultimately cripples their ability to function in the harsh, jagged reality of the world. Her love becomes a suffocating prison of safety.
And the book scales this psychological concept up to the level of the state. How does the author see the modern welfare state operating as this devouring mother?
The text argues that leftism has institutionalized this toxic maternal instinct. The claim is that the modern state operates like the terrible mother by prioritizing emotional safety, consensus, and unearned equity over objective competence and merit.
So the government is treating us like toddlers.
That's the argument. Just as the devouring mother smothers her child's independence, the bureaucratic state allegedly smothers the competence of its citizens. It treats adult populations, and the book emphasizes adult men specifically as infants who must be constantly managed, coddled, and protected from the consequences of their own actions.
It's an inversion of the patriarchal logos we talked about earlier.
A complete inversion. The text suggests that the state demands the infants be given resources without effort, while the predators, which the book defines as the competent, the builders, the men who actually generate value, are taxed and regulated into submission to fund this smothering womb.
And that dynamic leads into what is probably the most controversial, highly charged claim in the entire book. The author turns his focus to the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in the United States, and he applies this rigid game theory analysis to its long-term effects.
The daddy government theory.
Yes, daddy government. He essentially claims that the state has replaced the husband. Walk us through the step-by-step logic of how the book constructs this argument.
Well, the book approaches the 19th Amendment not as a milestone of civil rights, but as a fundamental shift in the evolutionary and economic sexual marketplace.
Okay, explain that.
The game theory model presented relies on the premise that historically, marriage was a vital economic and social contract. Women traded reproductive potential and exclusivity for male provision and physical protection.
A survival contract.
Yes. The text posits that once women gained the power of the ballot box, they collectively voted to shift the burden of provision from individual husbands to the state bureaucracy.
Through things like welfare and social safety nets.
Right. Through welfare programs, subsidized health care, and state-enforced alimony and child support. The argument is that women essentially trade their sexual autonomy to the government in exchange for corporate tax dollars. In this model, the bureaucratic state assumes the role of the alpha male surrogate husband.
The state becomes the ultimate provider.
Exactly. It provides the financial safety net that historically had to be secured by carefully selecting a competent male partner.
And according to the text, this shift in the safety net has severe biological and evolutionary consequences. The book claims this creates a dysgenic loop. What is the evolutionary psychology argument being made here about how this alters mate selection?
In evolutionary psychology, mating strategies are often broadly categorized into two types: CAD and DAD.
CAD and DAD.
DAD strategies focus on long-term provision, delayed gratification, and high parental investment. These are the traits necessary for raising offspring in environments where resources are scarce and hard to acquire. CAD strategies, on the other hand, focus on short-term mating, dominance, physical excitement, and genetic fitness, but with very low parental investment.
Because they don't stick around.
Right. The book argues that because the state now guarantees baseline resources and survival, regardless of a biological father's presence or competence, women are no longer economically penalized for making poor mating choices.
So the risk of choosing a CAD is removed by the government.
That is the assertion. Therefore, women are incentivized to prioritize CAD genes over DAD resources. The text claims this creates a dysgenic loop, where society breeds for short-term impulsivity rather than long-term planning and responsibility.
And what happens to the men who would traditionally be the providers?
By outsourcing provision to the government, the book argues that the state neuters the male population. It suppresses high-value mate-guarding tactics. The nuclear family is effectively dismantled and turned into a subsidiary of the bureaucracy, leaving the child orphaned from a biological father and made a ward of the machine.
That is an incredibly heavy claim. And if the state is acting as both the surrogate father and the terrible mother, providing this vast safety net, there has to be a massive apparatus managing it all. The book points to what it calls the NGO grift class.
Yes, the managerial class.
Right, and it draws a direct parallel between modern bureaucracy and the historical dynamic we talked about earlier between Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels.
The author views professional activists, diversity consultants, and massive corporate HR departments as the modern iteration of that exact parasitic relationship, but scaled up to an industrial level.
So Marx living off Engels is the prototype for the HR department.
That's the frame. Recall how the text framed Marx, surviving off the capital generated by Engels' factories, while simultaneously despising the capitalist system that produced that wealth. The book argues that the NGO grift class operates the exact same way.
Oh, so?
They are described as the priests of a new religion, suckling at the teat of taxpayer funds and corporate budgets. They produce no tangible goods or services. Instead, they sell indulgences in the form of diversity training and equity audits.
Like medieval priests selling forgiveness.
Exactly. They live off the surplus labor of the productive classes while actively despising the very men who fund their existence. The text claims their ultimate goal isn't genuine equality, but the institutionalization of a system where their lack of hard skills is masked by bureaucratic power. This allows them to use the state as a bludgeon against the competent.
Which brings up a crucial mechanism. How does this managerial class actually enforce their will? Because the book argues they don't do it through traditional debate. Instead, it introduces concepts called the sophist's suicide and the zombie protocol.
This is where the text moves from sociology into actual biology.
Right, making specific neurological claims about what constant exposure to digital outrage does to the human brain. Let's explore the biological side of that claim, specifically regarding the anterior cingulate cortex.
This is a really fascinating intersection of neuroplasticity and digital culture. The anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, is a region of the brain involved in several complex cognitive functions. That includes impulse control, empathy, and crucially, conflict monitoring and error detection.
So it's the part of the brain that handles disagreement.
Yes. In everyday life, when you encounter a piece of information that contradicts your existing worldview, the ACC lights up to help resolve that cognitive dissonance. It allows for nuance and the integration of new data.
But the book claims the digital world is breaking this hardware.
That is the zombie protocol. It's the assertion that the modern digital landscape, specifically the dopamine loops generated by outrage porn on social media, literally degrades this hardware. The text claims that chronic, relentless exposure to high arousal, low-resolution digital content overstimulates and ultimately shrinks the ACC.
Shrinks it physically.
Yes. The result is a brain that is physiologically less capable of processing nuance or tolerating cognitive dissonance.
And the behavioral result of that degraded hardware is what the book calls the NPC hive mind.
NPC meaning non-player character.
Right. It compares modern activists to background characters in a video game, running on downloaded scripts rather than generating independent thought.
Exactly. The argument is that because the neurological capacity for conflict resolution has been damaged, these individuals lose their internal monologue. When challenged, they cannot analyze the opposing argument.
Because they lack the hardware to do so.
Right. Instead, they regurgitate pre-programmed, scripted talking points from the collective consciousness. Buzzwords like systemic racism, intersectionality, or punching up. The text posits that they aren't actually expressing independent, reasoned opinions. They are simply running an automated defensive script, making them physically and psychologically incapable of engaging with data that contradicts their worldview.
If the hardware is damaged, the software of communication also changes. The book argues this leads to the destruction of the trivium, a process it calls the sophist's suicide. Now, for historical context, the classical trivium consists of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. For centuries, this was the absolute foundation of Western education. It was designed to teach a student how to think rather than what to think.
And the author details a surgical three-part destruction of this classical foundation.
Let's go through them. First is the destruction of grammar.
In the classical sense, grammar isn't just about punctuation. It's about the accurate, objective definition of words and concepts. The book argues the left has replaced grammar with newspeak, dissolving rigid definitions into a gray sludge of relativism.
Changing what words actually mean.
Yes. The text points to the redefinition of words, such as changing the definition of racism to require institutional power, or the inability to biologically define the word woman. The premise is that if you can decouple words from objective reality, you strip the population of their ability to accurately describe and therefore defend reality.
Which perfectly aligns with their war on logos.
Exactly. The second pillar is the destruction of logic. Classical logic relies on reason, non-contradiction, and cause and effect. The text claims this has been replaced by critical theory.
How does the book define critical theory?
It defines it as a fundamentally paranoid framework that views all human interactions, knowledge, and institutions strictly through the lens of power struggles between oppressor and oppressed. It operates as a viral agent. It's designed to bypass rational debate by simply dismissing opposing logic as an artifact of white supremacy or patriarchy.
So you don't have to argue the point, you just accuse the logic itself of being corrupt.
Exactly.
And the final pillar, rhetoric.
Rhetoric, historically the art of persuasion through structured argument, has been replaced by shame and guilt. Because the opponent's logic has been dismissed via critical theory, the only tool left is emotional manipulation.
So they attack the person, not the idea.
Right. The text argues that the modern left utilizes tone policing, cancel culture, and emotional blackmail to trigger fear responses in the amygdala of their opponents. They bypass the logical neocortex entirely, using the threat of social exile to force compliance.
If persuasion is abandoned in favor of manipulation, the strategy for capturing society changes entirely. The book dives deeply into the concept of cultural Marxism, specifically referencing the Long March through the institutions.
A very famous phrase.
Yes. This strategy was originally articulated by figures like the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci and later popularized by the German student activist Rudi Dutschke. The premise is that classical Marxism failed economically in the West, so the revolution had to pivot.
And that pivot is central to the author's historical timeline. The text notes that classical Marxist uprisings failed in the West because, quite simply, the working class liked the material benefits of capitalism.
They liked having stuff.
They like electricity, food security, and consumer goods. They were not going to violently overthrow a system that was making them wealthier. Recognizing this, theorists like Gramsci argued that the revolution couldn't be won on the factory floor. It had to be won in the mind.
Hence the Long March.
Right. The Long March was a deliberate, decades-long strategy to infiltrate the cultural transmission belts of society. The universities, the media, the entertainment industry, and the bureaucracy. If you can't win the economic argument, you cheat in the culture by capturing the institutions that define what is true and what is moral.
The book provides several modern, specific examples of this cultural sabotage in action. It takes aim at the 1619 Project, the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the structure of the modern education system. How does the author tie these specific events to that overarching strategy of the Long March?
The examples are chosen to illustrate the destruction of the trivium in real time. Regarding the 1619 Project, the text calls it a hallucinatory narrative of grievance. The project sought to reframe the founding of the United States not as an Enlightenment experiment in liberty, but primarily as a scheme to protect the institution of slavery.
And the book points out the historical backlash to that.
Yes. It notes that this framing was heavily criticized and debunked on factual grounds by highly respected historians like Sean Wielance and Gordon Wood. However, the author argues that historical facts are irrelevant to the movement. The goal is not historical accuracy, but narrative shame. It is an exercise in replacing grammar and logic with guilt.
And what about the COVID-19 pandemic?
With COVID, the text critiques the ubiquitous trust the experts mantra. It describes this as a mass-scale psychological operation that relied entirely on the logical fallacy of the appeal to authority.
Rather than scientific debate.
Exactly. The argument is that the rigorous, questioning nature of the scientific method was swapped for a dogmatic, unassailable totem called the science. This totem was then used to bypass debate, mandate compliance, and castrate the sovereignty of independent thinkers who questioned the efficacy or overreach of state mandates.
And finally, the education system.
In the realm of education, the book attacks the modern trend of eliminating tracking or advanced placement programs in schools. The author argues that acknowledging innate hierarchies, that some students are naturally faster, stronger, or smarter, shatters the utopian fantasy of equity.
So they just flatten it.
Yes. Therefore, rather than elevating the bottom, the system actively flattens the hierarchy, intentionally enforcing mediocrity so that no one feels the psychological discomfort of being outperformed.
It is an incredibly bleak diagnostic picture, but the final section of the book pivots sharply. Having diagnosed what he sees as a terminal cultural disease, Riker offers a very specific cure for his target audience. This section is titled The Shield of Athena, a manifesto for the truth warrior. The very first strategic move he demands of his readers is to refuse to pay what he calls the Danegeld. For those who might not know the history of that term, what does it mean in this context?
The Danegeld refers to the historical tax raised to pay tribute to the Viking raiders to stop them from pillaging lands, which, as history shows, only funded the Vikings and incentivized them to return for more.
Never pay the blackmail.
Exactly. In the author's framework, paying the Danegeld means apologizing to the outrage mob or attempting to appease the NGO grift class. His actionable advice to his audience is to execute a strategic, total withdrawal of validation, attention, and, where legally possible, tax dollars.
Starve the beast.
He instructs his readers to starve the beast. They must stop engaging within the leftist frame entirely. He writes that men must stop apologizing for their success, their ambition, their natural testosterone, or their history.
Because apologizing just proves guilt to them.
Right. The book argues that offering an apology to a mob does not buy forgiveness. It signs a death warrant by validating their delusions and admitting guilt in a kangaroo court. Instead, the author tells his readers to actively embrace being canceled.
Lean into it.
Yes, within his specific worldview, being hated by the terrible mother collective is not a punishment. It is the ultimate badge of honor for a high-value male. It is proof that a man has refused to submit to the demands of mediocrity.
Beyond just ignoring the mob, the book lays out very rigid lifestyle protocols to achieve what it calls mental and physical sovereignty. The author believes that you cannot fight a cultural war if your mind and body are compromised by the culture's products.
It's a holistic approach to resistance.
Very much so. Mentally, he advocates for strict 48-hour media fasts. The goal is to break that neural link to the digital hive mind, allowing the anterior cingulate cortex to heal. He argues that stepping away from the manufactured anxiety of cable news and social media reveals that the outrage is largely a performance designed to keep the population docile and afraid.
And the physical imperative is given just as much weight as the mental.
How does the book connect physical fitness to political resistance?
The text elevates physical fitness from a mere health hobby to a profound, visible political statement against the entropy of the modern world. The author urges his readers to lift heavy iron, to reject processed carbohydrates, seed oils, and soy, and to intentionally build a Spartan physique.
So lifting weights is political.
In this framework, absolutely. The underlying philosophy is that the body and the mind are inextricably linked. The book argues that a man with a weak, lethargic body and a mind flooded with digital propaganda is easily manipulated. He's a leaf in the wind.
But a strong man.
Conversely, a man who has forged a Spartan physique through discipline and who maintains a stoic mind becomes an immovable object. The act of lifting weights is framed as a literal physical reclamation of the masculine logos.
Because it's cause and effect in its purest form.
Exactly. It is the imposition of order, will, and cause and effect upon the chaotic biology of the body. It proves to the individual that effort yields objective reality, completely bypassing the subjective relativism of the culture.
And the final piece of this armor involves what the book calls reclaiming the transcendentals. In classical philosophy, the transcendentals are truth, beauty, and goodness. The author gives his audience a reading list, demanding they engage with the Western canon. He lists Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Marcus Aurelius, and John Locke. Why are these specific texts viewed as the ultimate defense mechanism?
The book views the Western canon as an intellectual vaccine. By mastering the classical trivium and absorbing the works of foundational philosophers, the text argues that a man can immunize his mind against the self-loathing and guilt peddled by Marxist critical theory.
It trains the mind to spot the lies.
Yes. The author believes that reading Aquinas or Aristotle trains the mind to recognize objective truth and logical fallacies in real time, allowing a man to surgically dismantle emotional manipulation. Furthermore, the text commands its readers to seek out classical beauty.
So, avoiding modern art.
It explicitly tells them to buy art and consume media that celebrates the classical human form, heroism, and triumph, rather than what the author dismisses as the degenerate trash of postmodernism, which he views as an intentional celebration of ugliness and disorder.
It's an entire lifestyle overhaul.
It is. The ultimate overriding message of the manifesto is a call to arms for the reader to become a man who is entirely self-sufficient, needing absolutely nothing from the state. The author calls this honoring the patriarchal contract.
Which entails what, exactly?
This involves a commitment to building independent wealth, securing and defending one's home, and training the mind to a razor's edge. The overarching goal is to render the bureaucratic state and its social engineering completely irrelevant by becoming competent, armed, dangerous, and utterly free from its influence.
The scope of the framework we've just walked through is undeniably massive. We have traveled from the visceral, squalid reality of boils on Karl Marx's skin in a freezing Soho apartment, explored the deep psychological origins of Nietzschean resentment, analyzed the game theory of the 19th Amendment and the evolutionary psychology of the welfare state, and mapped out the bureaucratic structures of modern HR departments alongside the neurological impact of digital outrage on the human brain. The author leaves virtually no stone unturned in his attempt to map the battle lines of what he calls the war on logic.
It is a sweeping architectural blueprint of a highly specific, uncompromising worldview. The author has taken threads from historical biography, evolutionary psychology, game theory, classical Greek philosophy, and modern cultural critique, and synthesized them into a singular, fierce manifesto.
He's certainly thorough.
He is. The text is aimed directly at redefining and hardening masculinity and individual sovereignty in the 21st century. Whether one finds the premises compelling or fundamentally objectionable, the sheer intricacy and integration of his arguments demand careful analysis to understand the movement he's speaking to.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought for you to chew on, building on the mechanisms we've explored today. If society's operating systems are truly just a massive historical tug of war, between the harsh, jagged, objective logic of the patriarch and the suffocating, emotional, equitable safety of the terrible mother, as this framework posits, is a perfectly balanced society even possible anymore? Or are we doomed to swing violently between these two extreme archetypes as digital algorithms and biological drives continue to amplify our most basic psychological instincts? Something to mull over as you look at the world around you.
It's a heavy question.
It is. Thank you for taking this intense deep dive with us today. Before you go, please remember to like and subscribe to the show. And if you want to explore the arguments, the history, and the frameworks we broke down today for yourself, head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy Karl Fowl Marx, The Original Shitlib. Also, make sure to follow the author at Conrad Wingrecker on Substack and Twitter to see more of his unfiltered thoughts and writings. Until next time, keep digging deeper.